Welcome to 1629 of the Heidegger series, and we will once more go into Wittgenstein, Rethinking the Inner by Johnston. We are currently at chapter 6, the inner-outer picture. And we've been discussing how intricate and much and very complex inner and outer is in language, in the world. And this, so to speak, oversimplification berates a lot of the intricacies, how the inner and outer are interwoven. It is this very intricacy that makes it possible for there to be an inside and outside. So it was a while, it was 10 days. We are now continuing where we left off in 1616. Now I will reread the last. The key point is that the concept of the inner is part of our game, not its empirically given basis. What I want to say, therefore, is that the inner differs from the outer in its logic. And that in any event, this logic clarifies the picture of inner and outer, makes it comprehensible. Our concepts of the inner and the outer are not the expression of metaphysical truths, but part of the particular game we happen to play. If that game involves uncertainty, this is not because the inner is private or the outer inherently unreliable. Rather, the uncertainty is built into our concepts. So that the uncertainty of the ascription, he is in pain, might be called a constitutional uncertainty. The uncertainty of our language game is one factor which can lead us to misunderstand it. For we assume that the language game must be simpler than it is, and mistake the uncertainty for a defect. In fact, there's nothing wrong or missing from the language game. The fact that the outer makes the inner probable is not a defect in evidence, but the key to understanding its nature. What really matters is not that the evidence makes the feeling, and so the inner merely probable, but that we treat this as evidence for something important. That we base a judgment on this involved sort of evidence, and so that such evidence has a special importance in our lives and is made prominent by a concept if the possibility of acting sorrow on the stage proves the unreliability of evidence, it also proves its reality. The evidence is not uncertain because it is outer, but because it is part of a particular game. The uncertainty lies in our concepts, not in the relation between the outer and inner. As Wittgenstein puts it, the connection between evidence and that for which it is evidence is here not a fixed one, and I don't mean the connection between the outer and the inner. On the contrary, that connection is crucial, and since the outer constitutes the criteria for the inner, one could say that uncertainty about the inner is uncertainty about the outer. For an uncertainty about whether someone is pleased is an uncertainty about the genuineness of her smile. one way of undermining the idea that the outer is the source of uncertainty is to note that in a sense the inner too may be indeterminate. Consider, for example, our earlier discussion of the difference between genuine and feigned emotion. As we saw there, pretense involves more than simply using pain expressions when not in pain. Rather, it presupposes a pattern of behavior of a particular kind, and one which is sufficiently complex for the concept of deceit to be at home in it. One implication of this, however, is that one cannot simply divide outer expression into the two exclusive categories, genuine and feigned. For example, someone might give signs of joy, then act in a completely unexpected way, and yet not in a way that showed she was pretending, but in a way which simply leaves us at loss of what to make of her initial reaction. Here, it is not the outer that is uncertain. Rather, the person's behavior defies our normal categories. So there's no clear answer as to how we should represent her inner. If we ask, what inner state was she in? The question has no answer. In this sense, the foundation of our language game and what makes possible our use of psychological concepts is the fact that our behavior is sufficiently regular for us to be able to see patterns in it. On the other hand, it is not so regular as to be describable in terms of rules, so that if we do describe it in terms of patterns, these must be sufficiently flexible to encompass a degree of irregularity. What does it mean, though, to say that our concepts have a degree of indefiniteness built into them? As we have already seen, the criteria for a particular state are not rigidly defined. but more fundamentally, what is involved in saying that someone is in that state is also not completely determined. Not only are the consequences of the inner state unspecified or only specifiable in general terms, but it may be unclear whether or to what extent the individual's state falls in to any of the general patterns we invoke. Thus, it is not the case that uncertainty in recognizing his annoyance, for example, is simply an uncertainty about his future behavior. It lies much more in the uncertainty of the criteria for the concept. So sometimes he is, as it were, transparent, and sometimes not. And listen now, and it is misleading if one thinks of the real annoyance as, so to speak, the expression of the inner face. Such that this facial expression is perfectly clearly defined, and it is only the outer one which leaves it uncertain whether his soul really has this expression. Here the uncertainty in the application of the concept of annoyance is nothing to do with the unreliability of the outer. Rather, it reflects the loose fit between our concepts, which treat life as the recurrence of the same and the limitless variety of that life itself. The life pattern we refer to with the concept annoyance has a limitless number of forms. And although there are certain clear and typical examples, there are others. Where it is less clear what is being said when we describe someone as annoyed. In such cases, it may be impossible to extract the precise meaning of the claim from the particular context in which it is being applied. Indeed, we may again feel tempted to claim that language is inadequate, that the uniqueness of the real defies the universality of language. She was annoyed and pleased all at once. You would have to have been there and to know her as I do, to understand what I mean. Here the difficulty in describing the inner reflects not its hiddenness, but the limitless variety which characterize human life. To underline this point, consider a more unusual example, the concept love. Suppose an individual is involved with two people and we are uncertain which she loves most. The first inclination is to assume that if we do not know this, she must. To a certain extent, this is correct, for if she says she loves one of them and not the other, this may be enough to settle the matter. With a sophisticated concept like love, however, the language game allows for the possibility of self-deception and lack of self-knowledge. So that is extremely important. Furthermore, the individual herself may be genuinely uncertain which she loves, so that in that sense, even she would not know her inner. To resolve the question, we might propose various tests. For example, if she has to choose between them, we might take that as a decisive. However, the tests may conflict, and the normal use of the concept love does not establish any of them as a definitive. We may therefore conclude that there is no determinate answer as to whom she loves best. Here her inner state is not something that we cannot know because we cannot penetrate the veil of the outer. Rather, there is nothing determinate to know. We could specify a new test to decide what conclusion we should reach. But the point is that our existing concept is not of this nature. Like other psychological concepts, it has a degree of indeterminacy built into it. The circumstances of her later life may persuade us and her to view her feelings one way or another. On the other hand, we may simply accept that there is no answer, that there is no simple way of describing what she felt. Here, the indeterminacy of the inner is a feature of its very essence. This example highlights our tendency to take the inner for granted. We want to treat it as an object which is simply there, and if we encounter difficulties describing it, we blame these on its inaccessibility. In fact, it is better seen as a construct, a picture we use in our mutual understanding. Our ability to view each other's actions and statements as expressions of an inner presupposes a kinship between us. For there is no guarantee that such an understanding should exist. It is conceivable, for example, that we should come across people who were simply unable, who we were simply unable to find our feet with. Their behavior, while not random, may strike us as illogical, and it may be impossible for us to relate it to the patterns that characterize our lives. The same point applies to their utterances, for as we saw in chapter 4, statements such as the vowel E is yellow or everything feels unreal to me are literally nonsensical. And yet we can find each other through them. So much so that such unique, non-paraphrasable communication can be what means most to us. The kinship which lies behind our psychological concepts also makes itself apparent in another way. For what gives unity to these varying and irregular patterns is our sense that they group together what belongs together. In this way, we are able to treat a host of different things, e.g., a facial expression, a gesture, a piece of behavior, and some utterances as expressions of the same inner state. There's no guarantee, however, that we should be able to understand all living beings in this way. In principle, there is no reason why the linguistic and non-linguistic reactions of all beings should be the same. As Wittgenstein famously remarked, if a lion could talk, we could not understand him. Similarly, we might come across apparently intelligent people whose actions we could make no sense of. In such a case, what should we say of their inner life? Depending on how different their lives were from ours, we might conclude either that their inner life was simply different from ours, or that they had no inner life at all. That is, that they were not in fact the conscious beings they appeared to be. Well, I think this misunderstanding here that Wittgenstein clears up is of incredible importance. This enormous oversimplification of the inner, and the assumption that a person's actions, emotions reflect an iconic, unchangeable innerness, a face that is the true intention, is almost ignorant. It rids us of the complexities of the soul, and that people honestly have very different knowledge of their inner. Some might know nothing at all. Remains of the Day by Kanzaburo Uwe comes to mind here, where the butler had no idea he's infatuated with the maid, which became a very fantastic movie by Anthony Hopkins as the character of the butler. Inside of us is a humongous complexity that is not truly only inside. It is interwoven with everything else. Otherwise, what would be the purpose of having language, expressions, perceptions, understandings? Somewhere one realizes it doesn't make sense. His slow mode of showing rather than putting arguments on a pile or a heap brings a lived understanding, I would say, an embodied understanding. It's an uncertainty that is built into the concepts. It's not a lack of understanding or ability. This is how the world truly is. And I like this. The uncertainty of our language game is one factor which can lead us to misunderstand it. For we assume that the language game must be simpler than it is, and mistake the uncertainty for a defect. Or something to be sold. This goes much further. It's showing the human spirit, soul, the creative, fantastic power of a complexity beyond any limits of crude inner and crude outer. Put a pause there and return in a bit. So it's a revival of the soul, nothing less, I would say, Wittgenstein. And we continue on page 197, just where I left off. Here it is also interesting to consider our conception of the inner life of a mad person. For we tend to think of this as an indescribable flux, and yet the incoherence of this flux is simply a symbol for the incoherence of her actions. To sum up, we can see three related aspects of our language game as contributing to the indeterminacy which characterize it. First, it is a game based on fine shades, and one where the criteria are not fixed. The idea that talk of knowledge is inappropriate reflects the fact that one must be acquainted with the person to be able to judge, very good here, what significance to ascribe to his expressions of feeling. And also that one cannot describe what it is that one recognizes in them. Second, the consequences of a particular inner state are not rigidly determined. One cannot say what the essential observable consequences of an inner state are. When, for example, he really is pleased, what is then to be expected of him, and what not? There are, of course, such characteristic consequences, but they cannot be described in the same way as reactions which characterize the state of a physical object. Finally, the importance of variation and the consequent flexibility of our concepts mean that there is no rigid fit between our concepts and experience, that the inner is not always determinate. Genuineness and its opposite are not the only essential characteristics of an expression of feeling. One cannot, for example, say whether a cat which purrs and then lashes out was pretending. It could be that a person gives signs of joy, then acts in a completely unexpected manner, and yet we couldn't say that the first expression was not genuine. If we now ask, could these uncertainties be eliminated? There's no clear answer to the question. The impossibility of knowing what someone else is feeling is, in a sense, both a physical and a logical impossibility. First of all, one can think of possible ways of gaining information about another person that don't in fact exist. So there's a physical impossibility. If we could read someone's thoughts directly from her nervous system, our current game would be undermined. Why bother with uncertain utterances, one might argue, if you can read the book? On the other hand, there is a logical impossibility in that our game is characterized by the absence of more exact rules of evidence. Throwing over the game would involve a huge change in our lives and would radically change our relation to others as well as to ourselves. How would the fact that others could predict our behavior affect our relation to ourselves? Would we still regard our deeds as our own, or would we view our own lives fatalistically as the playing out of a mechanical process. The hypothesis that we could read and so predict the behavior of others conjures up a completely new world. And it is hard to follow through the hypothesis and to be sure how we might react to this world. In the end, the question of whether we would accept a different game is an open one. Then now remains the question whether we would give up our language game, which rests on imponderable evidence and often leads to uncertainty. If we have the possibility of exchanging it for a more exact one, which on the whole had similar consequences. We could, for example, work with a mechanical lie detector and redefine a lie as whatever produces a certain result on the lie detector. The question, therefore, is would we change our form of life if such and such were placed at our disposal? And how could I answer that? Where then does all this leave the inner, outer picture? As we have seen, this picture is neither an expression of metaphysical truth nor a depiction of the facts of the matter. Rather, the picture expresses certain conceptual relations which together form our concept of the human subject. Here it is worth reconsidering our earlier discussion of thinking and consciousness. For now, we can set these issues in a wider context. As we noted then, thinking cannot be represented accurately either as an activity in itself or as an accompaniment of other activities. Rather, and this is very, very important, do not miss this out, rather the word thinking as opposed characterizes the way an activity is carried out. One way of capturing this difference is to treat thought as if it were a continuous inner monologue. For example, when a man acts intelligently, we may say it's almost as though he spoke to himself. In such cases, however, there's no necessity for the individual actually to talk to herself. Rather, the point is that there is a potential explanation of all she's doing. And that if she is interrupted and asked, she will be able to give it. Here, the possibility of giving an explanation is pictured in terms of a continuous activity of thinking. Similarly, the difference in the way the person acts. The fact that she acts thinkingly. Is represented in terms of a special supplementary activity. The person who acts thinkingly does many things which someone acting mechanically does not. And thinking is the imaginary auxiliary activity, the invisible stream which carries and connects all these kinds of actions. So good, it needs to repeat. The person who acts thinkingly does many things which someone acting mechanically does not. And thinking is the imaginary auxiliary activity, the invisible stream which carries and connects all these kinds of actions. Talk of the inner is a way of representing these ideas. The world of consciousness and ceaseless flow of thoughts and experiences is a picture which captures our concept of a subject. As well as expressing certain conceptual relations that the inner outer picture captures fundamental aspects of our relation to others. Indeed, to the extent that the inner seems irredeemably mysterious. This reflects our sense of the mystery of life. As we saw, the absence of predictability and mechanical regularity is central in our response to something as alive, and more particularly as human. There is a qualitative difference between our reaction even to an animal and to a complex machine. And that difference goes beyond the fact that the actions of the latter are easier to describe in mathematical terms. Watching an animal, we see it as alive, just as looking into the face of a human being, we see it as consciousness. Here, the inner-outer picture connects up with our deepest feelings and reactions. As Wittgenstein notes, I am inclined to speak of a lifeless thing as lacking something. I see life definitely as a plus, as something added to a lifeless thing. Similarly, a human face makes a unique impression upon us. The expression of soul in face, one really needs to remember that a face with a soulful expression can be painted. In order to believe that it is merely shapes and colors that makes this impression. it isn't to be believed that it is merely the eyes, eyeball, lids, eyelashes, etc. of a human being that one can be lost in gaze of, into which one can look with astonishment and delight, and yet human eyes just do affect one like this. Such reactions are important because they illustrate the attitudes which underlie our language game. The notion of the inner may be a picture, but it captures the essence of our relationship to others and to ourselves. One way of underlining the special role which the inner outer picture plays in our lives is to note that talk of someone having an inner can hardly be called an opinion. For example, when we look into someone's eyes with astonishment and delight, it would seem strange to say that we merely believed she has a soul. Here the word believe goes against the grain, for it treats something pivotal to our whole lives as on the same level as a contingent truth. What would it be like to believe someone had a soul, inner, and discover that she did not? It could hardly be compared to discovering that someone who we believed lived in London actually lived in Manchester. In fact, the claim that someone has an inner is an expression of our relation to her as a human being, not the statement of an empirical truth. Thus, while we might say of someone, I believe she is suffering, it would be strange to add, and I also believe she isn't an automaton. One way of illustrating this is by considering what it would actually mean to say that someone was not an automaton. What information would this give if it was said of another human being? None, or at the very most, that this man always behaves like a human being and not occasionally like a machine. The statement that someone is not an automaton conveys no information, because what it expresses is a relation that precedes opinion. My attitude towards her is an attitude towards a soul. I am not of the opinion that she has a soul. But what is the difference between an attitude and an opinion? I might say attitudes come before opinions. In the case of the soulless tribe, what would change if we cease to regard them as soulless would be our whole relation to them. In part, this might manifest itself in changes in the way we treat them. For example, as Norman Malcolm suggested in Wittgenstein's lectures, when the slaves become useless, we shall no longer do away with them. However, the use of the picture itself expresses a change in our relation to them. Indeed, at the extreme, one could imagine distinguishing between beings where the essential expression of the distinction was the choice of picture we use to describe her, their essence. Thus, normally, if you say, he's an automaton, you draw consequences. If you stab him, he will not feel pain. On the other hand, you may not wish to draw any such consequences. And this is all there is to it, except further muddles. The next chapter, 7, the mind, the brain, the soul. First, a quote from Remarks in the Philosophy of Psychology, first volume. The prejudice in favor of psychophysical parallelism is also a fruit of the primitive conception of grammar. For if one accepts a causality between psychological phenomena that is not mediated physiologically, one is taken to have thereby admitted the existence alongside the body of a soul, a ghostly spiritual entity. The account of the inner outlined in this book is likely to face two contrasting challenges. Some will complain, as Iris Murdoch has done, that Wittgenstein's approach to the inner comes dangerously close to denying the most crucial aspect of an individual's existence. In contrast, others will argue that Wittgenstein has not gone far enough and is himself still a prisoner of an anthropocentric myth that human consciousness is somehow special. However, as we shall try to show in this chapter, indeed, both are founded on the very confusions he was trying to undermine. Rebutting these criticisms should further clarify the thrust of Wittgenstein's argument and illuminate the non-substantive nature of his philosophy. It will also enable us to underline the importance of distinguishing our shared notion of the inner and associated ideas, such as the mind, on the one hand, from moral and religious concepts such as the soul, and on the other, from scientific concepts such as the brain. There were a lot of gems in the last text, without a doubt. the oddness of claiming that someone doesn't have a soul is pinpointed at the latter part of chapter 5. It has been mentioned before by Johnston, and it is important to repeat the oddity of that. See a person much more than the delineation around his body. He's all the interactions around him, back in history and into the future, and enormous web of relations, doings, purposes. And then you will see how absolutely absurd that expression would be. It is like he's more than soulful. He's not carrying a bag of soul in his rucksack. It is so much more. And it's this unexpectedness of the human being that shows that he is thinking. It is not mechanistic. It cannot to 100% be predicted. And listen to this. The person who acts thinkingly does many things which someone acting mechanically does not. It's on page 199. And thinking is the imaginary auxiliary activity, the invisible stream which carries and connects all these kinds of actions. So when we say that thinking is this stream of thoughts and words, that's a helpful tool. But actually thinking is something else. And here on page 198 we have this marvel. Rather, the word thinkingly as opposed to mechanically characterizes the way an activity is carried out. Doesn't reflect or represent or point to a hidden weird icon of truth. It's an activity. Otherwise the word thinking would not exist. And we often treat it as either pictures or a continuous inner monologue. But remember, that doesn't mean that it in any ways resembles an inner monologue. It's a helpful tool. It's an auxiliary. Confusing that leads to irresolvable philosophical problems that the history of Western thought has been trampling unnecessarily for millennia. Xenophanes, and many more, Plato, troubled by this, trying to solve irresolvable questions, not knowing that they were imaginary, so to speak, not of the true use of language. My hereby I conclude 1629, and thank you very much for participating. Bye bye.